At 30,000 feet, Sarah Chin was just another passenger in coach. She helped with crying babies and did crossword puzzles. Nobody knew she was Vampire, the most legendary military pilot alive. Then the captain collapsed from a heart attack, and someone whispered desperately, "Vampire, fly us home." Before watching full story, comment below from where are you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across Chicago O'Hare Airport as passengers hurried through the busy terminal with their luggage. Flight announcements echoed overhead while travelers checked their phones and grabbed last-minute coffee. At Gate B12, Sarah Chin sat quietly reading a paperback novel, looking like any other tired business traveler heading home. At 35, she wore simple jeans and a navy sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary military career she kept hidden from the civilian world. When the gate agent announced boarding for Flight 447 to Denver, Sarah closed her book and joined the line with her small carry-on bag. She moved with unconscious precision, but to everyone around her, she was just another ordinary passenger eager to reach her destination. The flight attendants smiled politely as she boarded, having no idea they were greeting someone whose call sign Vampire was legendary throughout military aviation circles. Sarah found her assigned seat in coach 23B, the dreaded middle seat. As she settled in, an elderly man in his 70s took the window seat beside her. "Going to Denver for business?" he asked with the friendly curiosity of experienced travelers. Sarah shook her head. "Just heading home, you?" The man's face lit up as he explained he was visiting his grandson who had just started college. "First time flying alone since my wife passed," he admitted. Sarah's expression softened. "I'm sure he's excited to see you," she said kindly, drawing on genuine warmth that her military training had never hardened. A young mother struggling with a crying baby took the aisle seat, looking frazzled and apologetic. "I'm so sorry," she said to Sarah and the elderly man. "She hates flying." Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small toy. "Here, try this. Sometimes new sounds help." The baby immediately stopped crying, fascinated by the colorful object. "Thank you so much. Are you a mom?" the grateful mother asked. "No, I've been around kids before," Sarah replied quietly. She didn't mention that her real experience came from comforting terrified children during combat evacuations in war zones, when her helicopter landed under enemy fire to rescue civilians. In the cockpit, Captain Martinez completed his pre-flight checks with First Officer James Wright. Martinez was a seasoned pilot in his 50s with over 20 years of commercial aviation experience. Wright was newer to the job but competent, having recently transitioned from regional flights to major airlines. "Weather looks good all the way to Denver," Martinez said, scanning the instrument panel. "Should be smooth flying today." Wright nodded as he verified the flight plan. "Copy that. All systems green." Both men felt confident about the routine 3-hour flight ahead. The plane taxied smoothly and took off into clear skies. Sarah watched through the small window as Chicago shrank below them, the familiar sensation of ascent triggering memories of countless takeoffs from aircraft carriers and hostile airfields around the world. But her expression revealed nothing of her extraordinary flying experience. To her fellow passengers, she was simply another traveler gazing at the view. Flight attendant Lisa Torres, a friendly woman in her 40s, moved through the cabin offering drinks. "What can I get you?" she asked Sarah with a professional smile. "Just water, please." "Long day of travel?" Lisa inquired, making the small talk that helped pass time at altitude. "Something like that," Sarah replied with understated politeness, hiding the fact that she was returning from a classified Pentagon briefing about her next deployment. 30 minutes into the flight, the aircraft cruised peacefully at 30,000 feet. Passengers had settled into the familiar routine of air travel, some reading magazines, others dozing, a few chatting quietly with companions. Sarah worked on a crossword puzzle, appearing completely ordinary as she pondered 7-letter words for aerial maneuver. Behind her, a businessman talked loudly during the brief period when phone calls were permitted, discussing quarterly reports and merger details that meant nothing to Sarah compared to the classified intelligence briefings she regularly attended. The businessman finally ended his call and struck up a conversation with his seatmate about Denver's booming economy. 2 rows ahead, a family with young children shared snacks and played quiet games. College students scattered throughout the cabin typed on laptops or listened to music through headphones. It was the typical mix of humanity found on any domestic flight: business travelers, families, students, and tourists, all sharing the miracle of flight that had become as routine as taking a bus. Sarah continued her crossword, occasionally glancing out the window at the landscape passing below. The Great Plains stretched endlessly beneath them, a patchwork of farms and small towns connected by ruler-straight roads. She had flown over this same terrain countless times, but usually at much higher altitudes in military aircraft, often at night with nothing but instrument readings for company. The commercial flight felt almost luxuriously leisurely compared to the high-stakes missions that had earned her the call sign Vampire, a name that struck fear into enemy forces and inspired confidence among Allied troops. The call sign had originated during her third combat deployment, when she successfully completed a series of night missions that seemed impossible to her commanding officers. Flying a stealth helicopter deep into enemy territory, she had extracted wounded soldiers and stranded civilians under conditions that would have defeated most pilots. Her ability to appear suddenly out of the darkness, complete her mission, and vanish again before enemy forces could respond earned her the Vampire nickname. Over the years, the call sign became synonymous with miraculous rescues and impossible missions accomplished against all odds. But none of her fellow passengers knew any of this as they flew peacefully toward Denver. To them, Sarah Chen was just a quiet woman in coach who helped with crying babies and politely declined extra snacks. The elderly man beside her had dozed off, his head resting against the window. The young mother was feeding her baby a bottle while reading a parenting magazine. The businessman had switched to complaining about airline food to anyone who would listen. It was the normal symphony of commercial aviation, hundreds of people with their own stories and destinations, trusting in the skill of pilots they would never meet. In the cockpit, Captain Martinez and First Officer Wright maintained their professional dialogue, monitoring weather updates and communicating with air traffic control. The flight was proceeding exactly according to plan, with clear skies ahead and no indication of the crisis that was about to unfold. Martinez felt a slight headache coming on but attributed it to the early morning schedule and too much coffee. He had been flying commercial routes for decades without a serious emergency, and today seemed like it would be no different from thousands of other routine flights. Sarah completed her crossword and pulled out a thriller novel, losing herself in a story about international espionage that seemed almost quaint compared to her real-world experiences. She was 3 chapters into the book when the first sign of trouble appeared, a subtle change in the aircraft's engine sound that only someone with her extensive flying experience would notice. Most passengers continued their activities without any awareness that something was different, but Sarah's trained ear detected the slight variation in pitch that suggested a minor adjustment to the flight systems. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, watching for any sign of concern from the flight attendants. Lisa Torres continued her normal service routine, offering passengers extra beverages and checking that seatbelts remained fastened. There was no indication of alarm, and Sarah reasoned that the engine sound change was probably just a routine altitude or speed adjustment. Commercial pilots made hundreds of such modifications during every flight, responding to air traffic control instructions or weather conditions. She returned to her novel, though part of her mind remained alert to the aircraft's performance. The crisis began without warning at exactly 11:47 a.m., 1 hour and 15 minutes into the flight. Captain Martinez was reviewing the approach procedures for Denver International Airport when he suddenly felt a crushing pain in his chest. The sensation spread down his left arm and up into his jaw, accompanied by difficulty breathing and cold sweats. Years of flight training had taught him to recognize the symptoms immediately. He was having a heart attack at 30,000 feet, with 200 passengers depending on his skills to reach their destination safely. "James," he gasped to First Officer Wright, clutching his chest. "Something's wrong. I need you to take control." Wright looked over in alarm as Martinez slumped forward in his seat, his face pale and covered in perspiration. The captain's hands fell away from the flight controls as he struggled to remain conscious. "Captain?" Wright called, but Martinez could only manage weak groans of pain. In seconds, Wright realized he was facing every pilot's worst nightmare, the complete incapacitation of the aircraft commander during flight. Wright immediately activated the autopilot to ensure the aircraft remained stable while he assessed the situation. He had been trained for this emergency, but the reality was far more terrifying than any simulator exercise. Martinez was clearly having a serious medical crisis and was unable to provide any assistance or guidance. Wright was now solely responsible for the safety of everyone aboard, and he felt the weight of that responsibility like a physical force pressing down on his shoulders. "Mayday, Mayday, this is United 447, Wright transmitted to air traffic control, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We have a medical emergency with the captain. Requesting immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport." The response came quickly. "United 447 Denver Center, we copy your emergency." Maintain current heading and altitude. Medical personnel will be standing by. Wright acknowledged the transmission while trying to think through his options. In the cabin, passengers remained unaware of the developing crisis. The aircraft continued flying smoothly on autopilot, and there had been no announcement about any problems. Sarah noticed that the flight attendants had suddenly become more active, moving quickly between the front galley and the cockpit with worried expressions. Her military instincts, honed by years of combat operations, told her something significant was happening even before any official word reached the passengers. Flight attendant Lisa Torres approached the cockpit door and used her key to enter. What she saw inside confirmed her worst fears. Captain Martinez was unconscious and clearly in medical distress, while First Officer Wright struggled to manage both the aircraft and the emergency situation. "We need to make an announcement," Wright told her tersely, "and find out if there are any doctors on board." Lisa nodded and hurried back to the cabin to consult with her colleagues about emergency medical procedures. The announcement came over the intercom 5 minutes later, delivered in the calm professional tone that flight attendants master for crisis situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency that requires us to divert to the nearest airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. If there is a medical doctor on board, please identify yourself to the flight crew immediately." A murmur of concern rippled through the cabin as passengers began to understand that their routine flight had become something more serious. 3 passengers identified themselves as having medical training: a pediatrician, a nurse, and a paramedic who was deadheading home from a conference. They were quickly escorted to the cockpit to assess Captain Martinez's condition. The pediatrician, despite being outside her specialty, immediately recognized the signs of a massive heart attack. "He needs immediate medical attention on the ground," she told Wright grimly. "There's nothing we can do for him at this altitude except keep him comfortable and get him to a hospital as fast as possible." Wright felt his stress level increase dramatically as he realized the full scope of his situation. Not only was he responsible for landing the aircraft safely, but he was also racing against time to save the captain's life. Denver was still 40 minutes away, assuming everything went perfectly. He had landed at Denver International many times before, but always as the first officer with an experienced captain providing guidance and backup. Now he was completely alone in making every critical decision. The pediatrician and nurse did what they could to make Captain Martinez comfortable, administering oxygen and monitoring his vital signs. The paramedic helped move him to a more comfortable position and tried to keep him responsive, though Martinez remained only semi-conscious and unable to communicate effectively. "His condition is critical," the pediatrician reported to Wright. "Every minute counts." Wright nodded grimly and increased their descent rate slightly, pushing the aircraft toward Denver as fast as safely possible. In the cabin, passengers had become increasingly aware that this was not a routine medical diversion. The flight attendants' strained expressions and hurried consultations suggested something more serious than a passenger feeling ill. Sarah watched the activity with growing concern, her military training telling her to prepare for the possibility that the situation might deteriorate further. She had been in enough crisis situations to recognize the signs of an emergency that was not fully under control. That's when Chief Flight Attendant Maria Santos, a veteran of 25 years with the airline, made a decision that would change everything. Santos had worked on military charter flights early in her career and had developed contacts throughout the armed forces. She had access to a restricted crew database that included information about passengers with special qualifications, military personnel, off-duty pilots, air traffic controllers, and others who might be valuable in emergency situations. Santos quickly accessed the database on her tablet and ran a search for anyone on the passenger manifest with aviation experience. What she found made her heart race. Passenger Sarah Chin in seat 23B was listed with a military classification so high that most of the details were redacted. But one piece of information was clearly visible. Her call sign was Vampire, and she was designated as a special operations pilot with combat experience. Santos had heard whispers about Vampire throughout military aviation circles, legendary stories of impossible rescues and missions that sounded too incredible to be true. Without hesitation, Santos made her way through the cabin to row 23. Sarah looked up from her novel as the chief flight attendant approached with an expression of desperate hope mixed with professional urgency. "Excuse me," Santos said quietly, leaning down so other passengers couldn't hear. "Are you Sarah Chin?" Sarah nodded, puzzled by the formal approach. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you privately. It's about the emergency situation." Sarah followed Santos to the rear galley, where they could talk without being overheard by passengers. I've accessed your military record, Santos explained quickly. I know who you are and I know what you're capable of. We have a situation that's beyond our normal emergency procedures. Sarah's expression became alert and focused as her military training automatically engaged. What's the nature of the emergency? She asked in a tone that had suddenly shifted from casual passenger to professional aviator. Captain Martinez has had a heart attack and is unconscious, Santos explained. First Officer Wright is handling the aircraft alone, but he's never been the primary pilot in command during a real emergency. He's competent, but this situation is pushing him to his limits. We need someone with advanced flying skills to help get these people home safely. Santos paused, then looked directly into Sarah's eyes. Vampire, we need you to fly us home. The use of her call sign hit Sarah like an electric shock. For over an hour, she had been successfully maintaining her civilian cover, blending in perfectly with the ordinary passengers around her. But now her secret identity had been revealed, and with it came the crushing responsibility that she could never refuse, the duty to use her extraordinary skills to save innocent lives. The comfortable anonymity of Coach Seat 23B was gone forever, replaced by the familiar weight of command that she had carried through dozens of combat missions. How bad is Wright's condition? Sarah asked, her mind already shifting into tactical assessment mode. He's holding it together but barely, Santos replied. This is his first real emergency as the only pilot, and he's dealing with a time-critical medical situation on top of flying the aircraft. He needs backup from someone who's been in high-stress situations before. Sarah nodded grimly. Her military experience had taught her that even competent people could become overwhelmed when facing their first real crisis, especially when lives were at stake. What's the aircraft type and our current situation? Sarah asked, already mentally preparing to transition from passenger to pilot. Boeing 737-800, currently at 35,000 feet, 42 minutes out from Denver International, Santos replied. Wright has declared an emergency and we're cleared for priority approach, but... She hesitated. But what? Sarah pressed. But there's weather moving into Denver. Nothing severe yet, but it could complicate the approach if we're delayed at all. Sarah felt the familiar calm that always descended over her in crisis situations. This was what she had been trained for through thousands of hours of flight training and hundreds of combat missions. While the aircraft and situation were different from her military experience, the fundamental principles remained the same. Assess the situation, develop a plan, execute with precision, and adapt as circumstances changed. Take me to the cockpit, she said simply. And don't announce anything to the passengers yet. We need to assess Wright's condition first. As they moved toward the front of the aircraft, Sarah caught the eye of the elderly man in 23A, who was now awake and watching the activity with concern. She gave him a reassuring nod, the same expression she had used to comfort countless civilians during combat evacuations. The young mother with the baby looked up questioningly as Sarah passed, and again Sarah provided a calm, confident look that suggested everything would be okay. Neither passenger had any idea they were watching a legendary military pilot heading to take command of their flight. Santos used her key to open the cockpit door, and Sarah got her first look at the situation inside. Captain Martinez was slumped in his seat, unconscious but breathing with the assistance of oxygen. The medical team continued monitoring his vital signs while staying out of First Officer Wright's way. Wright himself looked pale and stressed, sweat visible on his forehead as he managed radio communications while monitoring the aircraft's multiple systems. His hands were steady on the controls, but Sarah could see the tension in his posture that indicated a man being pushed to his psychological limits. Right, Santos said carefully, this is Sarah Chin. She's got extensive aviation experience and she's here to help. Wright looked over with a mixture of relief and suspicion. In the middle of an emergency, the last thing he needed was some passenger claiming to be a pilot and getting in his way. What kind of experience? He asked tersely, not taking his eyes off the instruments for more than a second. Sarah stepped forward where he could see her clearly. Military Special Operations. Call sign Vampire. I'm here to provide backup, not take over. You're still in command. The call sign hit Wright like a thunderbolt. Even civilian pilots had heard whispers about Vampire, the legendary Special Operations aviator who had pulled off rescues that seemed impossible to anyone familiar with aviation. Stories filtered through pilot lounges and aviation forums about night missions behind enemy lines, aircraft brought home with battle damage that should have made flight impossible, and civilian evacuations completed under enemy fire. Wright had always assumed the stories were exaggerated military folklore, but now Vampire was standing in his cockpit offering assistance. "I need to know our exact situation," Sarah said, moving to where she could see the instrument panel without interfering with Wright's access to the controls. Years of military training had taught her the importance of gathering complete information before making any decisions. Wright quickly briefed her on their altitude, fuel situation, weather conditions at Denver, and the timeline for Martinez's medical emergency. Sarah absorbed every detail while mentally calculating their options. "Your approach so far has been textbook," Sarah told Wright, and she meant it. Despite his stress, he had followed proper emergency procedures and maintained aircraft control throughout the crisis. "What's your biggest concern right now?" Wright appreciated that she was asking for his assessment rather than trying to immediately take over. "The weather system moving into Denver," he replied. "If we hit any significant delays or have to divert to an alternate airport, I'm not sure I can handle a complex approach in difficult conditions while managing everything else." Sarah studied the weather radar display and the approach charts for Denver International Airport. The incoming system wasn't severe, but it would create crosswinds and reduced visibility that could complicate the landing, especially for a pilot already dealing with maximum stress. In clear conditions with no pressure, Wright would handle the approach easily. But emergency situations had a way of compounding problems, and Sarah could see the potential for the situation to spiral beyond Wright's capabilities. "Here's what I suggest," Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her legendary among military aviators. "You continue as pilot in command. I'll handle radio communications and systems monitoring so you can focus entirely on flying the aircraft. If conditions deteriorate or you need assistance with any aspect of the approach, I'm here as backup. You make all the decisions, I just provide support." Wright felt a tremendous sense of relief wash over him. Having someone with Vampire's reputation watching over the situation was like having an insurance policy against disaster. The arrangement worked perfectly as they began their descent toward Denver. Sarah smoothly took over communications with air traffic control, freeing Wright to concentrate on managing the aircraft's descent profile and approach configuration. Her military experience with complex radio procedures and emergency protocols proved invaluable as she coordinated with ground controllers about their medical emergency and priority approach clearance. Wright found himself able to think more clearly and fly more precisely now that he wasn't trying to juggle multiple high-stress tasks simultaneously. "Denver approach, United 447, we're beginning our descent with a medical emergency on board," Sarah transmitted with the crisp professionalism that controllers appreciated. "We need the most direct routing possible to minimize flight time." The response came back immediately, "United 447, cleared direct to Denver International, descent at pilot's discretion. Emergency equipment will be standing by." Sarah acknowledged while monitoring Wright's descent technique, ready to provide input if needed but pleased to see he was handling the aircraft well. As they descended through 20,000 feet, the weather system became visible on the horizon, a line of dark clouds moving toward Denver from the west. It wasn't a severe storm, but Sarah could see it would create exactly the kind of challenging conditions that could overwhelm a stressed pilot. Wright saw it too, and she noticed his grip tighten slightly on the controls. "Weather's moving faster than forecast," he observed tersely. "We might hit some rough air on approach." "I've seen worse," Sarah replied calmly, and Wright knew she wasn't boasting. Military pilots dealt with weather conditions that would ground commercial flights, often while under enemy fire or in aircraft with battle damage. If Vampire wasn't concerned about the approaching weather, then Wright could manage it too. "Let's discuss approach options," Sarah suggested. "Would you prefer the longer runway 34R for more margin, or the shorter 25 if the winds favor it?" Wright appreciated that she was giving him choices rather than making decisions for him. 34R gives us more room for error, he decided, and the emergency equipment can position there more easily. Sarah nodded and coordinated the runway selection with air traffic control while Wright configured the aircraft for approach. The Boeing 737 responded smoothly to control inputs, and all systems were functioning normally despite the crisis in the cockpit. At 10,000 feet, they encountered the first effects of the weather system, light turbulence that rocked the aircraft and created an uncomfortable ride for passengers. Wright compensated expertly, adjusting power and control inputs to minimize the rough air's impact. Sarah monitored his technique and was impressed by his skill. Under normal circumstances, Wright was clearly a competent pilot who could handle challenging conditions. The emergency situation had simply overwhelmed his ability to manage multiple high-stress tasks simultaneously. "Looking good," Sarah told him as they passed through 5,000 feet on final approach. Your descent profile is perfect and you're tracking the localizer exactly. Wright felt his confidence building as they neared the runway. Having someone with Vampire's experience confirm that he was flying well gave him the psychological boost he needed to complete the approach successfully. The aircraft broke through the cloud layer at 2,000 feet, and Denver International Airport appeared ahead through the windscreen. United 447, you're cleared to land runway 34R, wind 280 at 15 gusting to 22, the tower controller transmitted. The crosswind would make the landing more challenging, but Wright had dealt with similar conditions many times before. Sarah monitored his approach speed and configuration, ready to call out any problems but seeing none. Nice stable approach, she observed as they crossed the runway threshold. Just watch for that wind gust. Wright brought the Boeing 737 down smoothly despite the crosswind, touching down with barely a bump and deploying thrust reversers to slow the aircraft. Emergency vehicles were already rushing toward their position as they taxied clear of the runway. Outstanding landing, Sarah told Wright, and she meant it. Under incredibly stressful conditions, he had flown the aircraft perfectly and brought everyone home safely. You saved a lot of lives today. As the aircraft came to a stop at the gate, paramedics rushed aboard to treat Captain Martinez while passengers began to understand how close they had come to disaster. Wright shut down the engines and completed the post-flight checklist, his hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline wore off. I couldn't have done it without you, he told Sarah gratefully. Having Vampire in the cockpit. I've heard the stories, but I never thought I'd actually meet you. Sarah smiled modestly as she prepared to return to the cabin. You did all the flying, she reminded him. I just handled the radio calls. But they both knew her presence had made the difference between a successful emergency landing and potential disaster. Wright's skill as a pilot had never been in question, but Sarah's experience and calm leadership had given him the confidence to perform at his best when lives depended on it. As passengers began to deplane, many stopped to thank Sarah, somehow sensing that she had played a crucial role in their safe arrival. The elderly man from 23A shook her hand warmly. I don't know exactly what happened up there, he said, but I could tell you were helping take care of us. The young mother with the baby hugged her impulsively. Thank you for whatever you did, she whispered. I was so scared, but seeing you stay calm made me feel better. Sarah deflected the praise gracefully, insisting that First Officer Wright deserved all the credit for the successful emergency landing. But word was already spreading through the airport about the legendary military pilot who had appeared out of nowhere to help save Flight 447. Airport personnel who had heard the radio communications knew that Vampire had been in the cockpit, and within hours the story would become another chapter in the growing legend of the most skilled combat pilot of her generation. As Sarah collected her carry-on bag and prepared to continue her journey home, she reflected on how quickly her quiet anonymous flight had transformed into another life-or-death situation. She had boarded in Chicago as just another passenger and coach, hoping to travel unnoticed to her destination. Instead, she had once again found herself in command during a crisis, using skills earned through years of combat operations to save civilian lives. It was the burden and privilege of being Vampire. Wherever she went, people in desperate situations would always call on her when they needed someone who could perform miracles at 30,000 feet. The call sign Vampire had been earned through countless dangerous missions where failure meant death for the people counting on her skills. Today had been different from her military operations: no enemy fire, no combat damage, no night insertion behind hostile lines. But the fundamental challenge remained the same. Use extraordinary flying ability and hard-won experience to bring people home safely when the situation seemed impossible. As she walked through the Denver terminal, Sarah Chen looked like any other traveler continuing their journey. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she was already prepared for the next time someone would desperately call out, "Vampire, fly us home."